Today I am here with Don Christie, my former partner in crime. We'll talk a bit about that later on. Kia ora, Don, welcome.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and it's really good you could do this. And we're doing it at lunchtime this time instead of at the end of the day, but it'll be recorded and uploaded. For everyone who's here, you are welcome to ask questions of Don or I as we go through the session via the Q&A function. So just type your questions in the Q&A and I will seed them into the conversation with Don. So Don, to get us started, tell us a bit about you. What's your potted history?
My potted history. Well, I'm an immigrant to New Zealand. I was born and brought up in a wonderful country called Zambia. I was very fortunate to have had that experience. And I arrived here in 1991 and I rocked up in front of somebody who I just noticed is online called Garth Hamilton. So I better give Garth a nod. And
Nice.
And he gave me my first job in New Zealand, Garth. And so thank you for that and showing that trust in me. And we ended up, the first thing he did, of course, was send us down to Cromwell in the middle of nowhere to work on a project, on the Clyde Power project, which was just amazing and eye-opening.
And colder than Zambia, so, I'm sure.
Cromwell, well, it depends in the summer, although Zambia is on a plateau, so it can get cool there, and Cromwell can obviously get very hot and cold. Yeah, so we, the people who I founded Catalyst with in 1997, a lot of us came out of the company that first employed me, QED Software. And that had an amazing culture, and some of that we tried to replicate at Catalyst. It was actually founded and led by John Perry, who was a Māori digital leader very early on in that space. And I realized looking back just how much of his culture and thinking we've probably ourselves tried to adopt. That's with glorious hindsight. At the time, I didn't realize that. Yeah, and so, you know, fast forward now, since 1997, Catalyst has grown. We're about 5 companies, 2 in New Zealand and 3 overseas. And we're pretty proud of what we've achieved here.
Well, that's really cool. Thank you for that intro. And I really appreciate you being here because I know that you're, like many people, struggling with seasonal things at the moment. So, and I know it's hard to talk continuously when you're not feeling 100%. So thank you for that. Now, I thought I'd start by, you are pretty passionate about open source and a lot of people know you as the open source champion. So I thought I'd start by asking you, what's the short version of why open source is so very important?
I mean, open source is a superpower. It gives us capabilities beyond what we would have dreamed of, I think, when I got into IT in the 1980s. It allowed the internet to explode. It creates opportunity for collaboration, for development, and to bring products to market that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do that. I think it's incredible that a country like New Zealand, which is so much in its folklore of the whole number 8 wire self-sufficiency thing, is almost the last country in the planet to recognize the superpower of open source and what we could do with it. It's completely bonkers that a company like Catalyst can be one of the leading providers of learning management solutions globally. You know, we're the largest Moodle partner in the world, and that we can set up a company in New Zealand providing the same services as AWS and Azure using open source software, some of which we contribute to ourselves, but most of it came out of NASA and CERN and some of the largest companies in the world. So yeah, that's the beauty of open source. From a New Zealand perspective, there's a lot of focus on having our own sovereignty and enabling digital sovereignty, certainly in Māori circles, but also more broadly, and controlling our digital destiny. And I'm really glad that we have rocket labs in New Zealand, because I like to say, in the software digital space, we're basically told that, as Kiwis, we should only put little chips in the top of the rocket, but Rocket Lab proved that actually you can build the entire damn rocket. And I think that's what we can do in New Zealand, harnessing that superpower that's open source.
Nice. That's a great explanation. Thank you. And so some people here will know that you and I used to work together on an initiative called NZRise. And that was very focused on the issues facing New Zealand-owned digital technology companies and the opportunities like you've just described. In the 10-odd years that we did this, it was quite a long time, you must have had a highlight or two. I thought you could tell us a bit about what some of the highlights for you were.
Well, the biggest highlight is just how much Kiwis are prepared to support each other. It's quite one of the reasons for setting up NZRise was kind of like setting up an Alcoholics Anonymous for CEOs and business owners, setting up a support group where we could, bring our issues to the table and support each other through that, because we were really fortunate to experience quite a lot of that when we set up Catalyst, from people who'd founded other companies like Synergy and so on. But the other things that we did was really sort of try and promote the capability of New Zealand businesses. There's so much diversity here and so much capability that we really have to be careful we don't gut the local industry, and that we promote it as much as we can. Simon Mutter, when he was CEO of Spark, used to talk about wanting New Zealand to be a place where his kids would want to grow up and live. And you can't do that if you're not bringing cool jobs to New Zealand. And, that's what New Zealand businesses do. And some of the stuff that, I see around this country just totally floors me all the time in terms of what's being done in all sorts of different spaces, whether it's AI, agri-tech, rocket labs, or just plain delivering stuff that people need to have done in the New Zealand context. So, yeah, we have to make sure we nurture that. It's not something we can take for granted. And I think, we certainly changed the thinking of some politicians, and certainly with your work, some of the leading civil servants as well. Whether that's sustainable is another question. It's a lot of work.
And they change, so there's a new batch to educate now. I think the first point that you made about the support network for business owners and CEOs, I remember those coffee drop-ins that we used to run, and sometimes we'd get 10 people turning up, and they'd have all different problems, but there'd be someone at the table who would have already walked in those shoes and experienced that before. And it's really invaluable, that kind of opportunity to collaborate.
I think so. Even just because I try and find other groups that help with that sort of thing. Even just thinking about somebody else's issue that they might have brought up, one, it helps. I think it helps you as a person think about other people's issues, and it helps you sort of think about how you might more logically approach a problem that you have, rather than just throwing chairs around your office like Steve Ballmer used to do, which kind of sometimes is very tempting to do, but probably doesn't solve your problems.
Yeah, and it was, and people would come with businesses at all different ages and stages, with growing pains and different challenges. And a lot of people thought that all we ever talked about was government procurement, but actually there was just so much more to the group than just that selling for New Zealand companies.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's, you know, the next step would be to undertake something we tried many years ago, again with Synergy and others, was to try and create collaborations between companies so that we could get more overseas business back to New Zealand. That's something I don't think we really tried, but I think that's untapped potential
Yeah,
still.
maybe that can be our next project on. Um,
Yeah.
Back to the webinar. So I'm really keen to talk about 2024 and how it's shaping up. And it is shaping up to be a challenging year for the economy and an interesting year for tech. So I thought we could tackle the tech side of things first. At the moment, the media is dominated by news about advances in AI. What do you think we should be paying attention to in 2024 in the digital technology space?
So I guess there's a lot of, obviously I've talked about open source software, and related to that is open standards. And quite frankly, open standards has to underpin our thinking about everything, whether it's data, technology, and so on, because that's what's going to give us the choices we need going forward. So one, don't lose focus or regain the focus that we used to have on open standards in our field. The second thing about AI is a lot of the technology has been around for a long time, and you know, machine learning and so on has been used in very smart ways. If you look at companies like Imagine and so on, some of the stuff they've done to improve site safety and quality control and so on, and other companies, including Catalyst, have applied it at various points. So there's a huge amount of potential there for organizations to use their own data sets in clever ways that companies like Optimal BI will have known about for years, Victoria, but you know, in clever ways that give them a competitive edge, and you know, machine learning can automate and augment that. I think some of the other stuff that is kind of, you know, Google search on steroids or Wikipedia on steroids, that's fine, that's interesting. I personally, to me, it's kind of like Mr. Clippy side of things. And, you know, if you just look at the CVs that we get through now and the covering letters, they've all been ChatGPT generated, and it's kind of like a race to mediocrity. So I've just warned people against that race towards mediocrity, and focus on your data, and focus on the fact that if somebody else like Microsoft or OpenAI value your data, then you better value it yourself. And you better work out how to get the value out of your data before somebody else takes it away from you, and you'll never get it back. And that's something that I think New Zealand really needs to think about hard, instead of saying, oh, we just need to race towards this AI side of things. Yes, we can unlock that potential, but for goodness sake, look after your data. It's your treasured possession. And if you lose that possession, you'll lose control over your business, over your farm, over your communities, and so on. So that's the side of things that I think we can really leverage as New Zealanders. And that we can do, you know, we're a different country from any other country in the world. We're a Pacific nation. We're a nation of immigrants and, you know, settlers. We're a nation of Pacific peoples, you know, obviously, in a nation that has Te Tiriti as its founding document, all of which make us bring different capabilities and make us a unique country. So we shouldn't give that uniqueness away. That's my thoughts on AI.
That's a really good thought. I heard a thing on the radio this morning where they were talking about when you buy a new car in the States, you automatically opt in to all of your driving behavior being shared with that car manufacturer's software, so that they can then sell that to your insurance company. And people are implicitly agreeing to this without actually necessarily ticking an I agree, just by virtue of signing up for their new car. I know we're not quite at that point here in New Zealand to the same extent, but what you mentioned that people need to really look after their own data, and have you got any thoughts about how we as a nation can do something differently so we don't fall into those same kind of traps where all of my driving behaviour is suddenly sold to my insurance company without me actually even explicitly saying, yes, I agree?
Yeah, I think this is where I find that New Zealanders and sometimes often people in the tech community sort of push this idea of learned helplessness, that we're helpless in the face of some of these overseas pushes, that if we want our new EV, then, you know, that we have no choice but to comply. Whereas other jurisdictions don't take that approach at all. I can't imagine, I might be wrong on this, but I can't imagine the Europeans allowing that.
No,
there's so much due diligence given to issues around privacy and so on, and there's just no need for it. We don't need to fall into those traps or habits, and it's easy to. We've already probably got lots of laws and regulations that manage that sort of stuff, and it's a case of just applying it within your jurisdiction. And if somebody tries to sell a car that does that, then you just don't give them an import license. And the chances are they've already fixed it for Europe. So fixing it for New Zealand is going to be a tiny thing for them to do. It's just it doesn't benefit them with the added amount of money that they can get from those peripheral businesses. So we've got to stop taking it as read that we can't do anything about. You know, a few years ago it was Uber. Now it's our data. You know, that we just are the equivalent of price takers, technology takers, and all this stuff. And we've got a lot more levers than we think.
Now, I've got a question from the Q&A to ask you from Ants before I get back to my questions. What changes, if any, can you foresee to overcome the challenges of open source software supply chain attacks, especially in the recent explosion of attacks in this area? I'm hoping you know what he's talking about.
Yeah, definitely. This is sort of like, you know, in a stack of any software, there's there's different layers that may or may not have been under the control of the people that wrote that software. So from the operating system right through to whatever JavaScript is running here on Zoom. The only thing I'd say about that comment is that there's an assumption that only open source software is vulnerable to that. Some of the main supply chain attacks that we've seen that have been most devastating have come through proprietary software like SolarWind, like Microsoft Outlook, and so on, that really, you know, have been certified up the wazoo and proven to be lacking. With the supply chain issue, there's been a lot of work in the open source world to build automatic capability that monitors everything that's in the software stack and monitors all the vulnerabilities that are known about that software stack, and that can then automatically patch, or report on and patch if patches are available on those stacks. So the supply chain issue, I think, in the open source world is probably a lot stronger and much more transparent than it is in the proprietary world.
And I think you make a really good point about it's not just open source that suffers from these kind of vulnerabilities and attacks. And there's been some really well documented ones in the Microsoft stack, for example, recently. So I wanted to get back to the next question I wanted to ask you is that let's talk about 2024 from an economic perspective and how it's shaping up for New Zealand businesses. And as a business owner in the digital technology space, I know you talk to a lot of people around the market. What are you hearing from people at the moment in the market?
Well, first of all, it's been a tough few years leading up to this year. You know, we got great support from the government during COVID, but work has been intermittent for a lot of companies since then. I think it's a damning indictment to New Zealand that we spend $12 billion a year in government on IT, and that right now the New Zealand technology sector is struggling. You know, there's a lot of companies that, you know, they were laying off staff before this current round of government layoffs. So I think that's a terrible indictment on how the New Zealand government does its procurement. I think these are interesting times. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in New Zealand and globally, but I don't want to get, this isn't a party political issue, but I do see, you know, a national-led government talking about focusing on outcomes, on, you know, short evidence-based deliverables. I think Christopher Luxon talks about 100-day plans. And really the sort of companies that are here that absolutely deliver to that and do that day in, day out are not your overseas Accentures or Deloittes or whatever. They're Kiwi companies, they're the Akamas, they're the Silver Stripes, Somars, Optimal BI, and so on. Those are the companies that can deliver absolutely to those sort of statements that are coming out of the current government, and should, you know, that's where I see our collective opportunity in the next few years. And you know, we can argue about whether or not this round of cost cutting is once again an example of governments doing things very tactically rather than strategically. But at some point, governments also have to be doing stuff, and so I'm hopeful now that they've got their first budget under their belt, that the government is now going to be into the mode of actually doing stuff and delivering.
But it's almost like we need to re-educate them or help them understand that if they want to stimulate the economy, then the government as a buyer has a lot of power to stimulate the economy, right? And they have a lot of power to therefore help New Zealand companies who are trying to export to also be successful domestically. And maybe we need to get that messaging kind of back to the politicians.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, one of the reasons that Catalyst has been so successful overseas was, and we have been successful overseas, is because of a project that we did for the tertiary, you know, the vocational learning sector back in 2003, where we basically put them online for, you know, for the equivalent of a tiny sum compared to what the universities were spending. And we did that through open source software. And our next client out of New Zealand was the Open University in the UK, which had 200,000 learners. And I think our largest overseas client now is the Open University of Nigeria, which has 600,000 learners.
Wow.
So all of that came through, you know, a government procurement, and it's all benefits New Zealand. One, the procurement, in my view, obviously, was the right thing to do. We got a good result for New Zealand for that particular project and need. But two, it stimulated an opportunity that we were able to leverage. And Ian McRae from Orion Health often goes back to something that happened in 1993 that got Orion Health off the ground and made it ultimately such a successful international
well, look at Datacom, our largest tech company in New Zealand grew out of New Zealand Post essentially as a cornerstone customer and part owner. So yeah, lots of examples. So getting back to talking about 2024 being a challenging year, and you've talked about how Catalyst has a global footprint and you employ folks all around the world. What are you seeing and hearing from other economies as compared with here? Is it just New Zealand that's having a challenging time, or is that happening globally at the moment in the tech space?
In the tech space, I'm not sure. Sorry, I'm not really talking to
That's okay.
peer companies overseas. What I would say overseas is that, you know, from a government perspective, governments have very much recognized that using open source software is a sort of trust multiplier. You know, the one time that was recognized in New Zealand was with the COVID app that the Ministry of Health developed, and they made it open source and they took good care of our data. We only let our data go when we wanted to, and so on. But Fortune 500 companies, governments overseas have very clear open source policies, and some of them even mandate open source. So we're seeing that happening overseas. particularly in OECD economies. And I think there's a comment up here, sort of just about how New Zealand seems to be behind that compared to the UK, and I'd absolutely echo that. As far as economies go, they all seem to be a little bit up and down. Europe seems to be a little bit down at the moment. The US seems to be a little bit up at the moment. So I don't know what's happening. I'm looking forward to some more rates cuts, interest rate cuts. I think, anyway, I won't go to economic policy.
Yeah, we won't get into that.
I don't think that helps. I don't think that helps us at all.
So you just mentioned one of the comments that is on the message board from Alistair about how he's come from the UK where open source is massive. Microsoft, as we all know, has a unnatural grip on this country. You look at any global Microsoft per capita, and definitely they have a large footprint here. So he opens his comments by asking you the question, what can we do to show the value of open source better and raise awareness, market it more appropriately? And then the end of his comments, he says open source does not equal bad quality. So what are your thoughts on that? And I know you've been trying to do this for many years, Don.
Yeah, yes, it's been a big part of my life. So maybe I'm not that good at it. What happened in the UK that was quite changing was in about 2010, I think there was a report came out called Better for Less, and one of the authors was a former CIO of one of the big government agencies, and one of the points they made was how the incentives for those big agencies, particularly if you're a CIO, was to have massive IT budgets and to be seen to have massive IT budgets. And then you got into a more and more exclusive club, It wasn't to find the best way of doing things. So that report landed, I think it might have been approved by the outgoing Labour government, and then the incoming Conservative government basically adopted it and ran with it. So there was a lot of work done in the UK around, adopting open source software and also focusing on engaging with local suppliers and measuring that on a daily basis. And you'll remember this as well, Victoria, how we used to talk about that to DIA. So I think bringing those examples back to New Zealand, and I think about an IT budget again of 12 billion and how, in my view, you could easily shave off 3 or 4 billion from that by using New Zealand suppliers and open source software. Not saying every New Zealand supplier has to be open source, but the combination of the two would transform our spend. And when you think about the savings the government has been trying to make, that was your tax break just there. So there's a narrative there, which is, could have made that tax break just through transforming how you do software in government, let alone the corporate sector. And the corporate sector in New Zealand is almost just as guilty as government, partly because many of our corporate leaders in the technology space are also resellers for some of these big organizations.
Yeah.
And so they're worried about, if you're a company like Catalyst, you don't have anyone really that you're reselling. We've got our open source platforms that we love to sell, like Moodle and Drupal and Overstripe and so on, but we're not in hock to any of these major overseas companies. And I think that holds New Zealand back a bit as well, in that some of our bigger suppliers feel that they can't rock the boat, and that's a bit of a shame.
They also have, the bigger corporates often have global agreements and other things they're part of. And then there's that whole risk adverse thing, that they're too risk adverse to take a punt on using a New Zealand owned company, and they'd rather use someone who they perceive has got deep pockets and can sign up to large liabilities. And then we know the reality is their outcomes aren't necessarily positive outcomes from those purchasing decisions. So yeah, you make a very good point about the corporates as well.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, I won't name them, but one of our local universities went out to tender for a new learning management system, and they, we're just down the road from them, and they didn't invite us to tender. So I sort of said, well, what do you know that the University of Cambridge doesn't know, and that the Open University of the UK doesn't know, and that Monash doesn't know, and that, as I said, the Open University of Nigeria doesn't know. And it just staggers me that those kind of assumptions are made about New Zealand technologies and suppliers all the time. That I can say this about Te Pukenga now because there's been a big changeover, but when that was first being set up, the message to the market was they were going to have to go overseas to find suppliers for their digital technology because they were too big for any New Zealand organization. And again, I sort of think, well, New Zealand's not that big a country. We're only 5.5 million people. We've only got 200,000 vacation, whatever.
Yeah.
It's not that big a problem that New Zealand companies aren't in a good position. And in fact, we're the right scale to provide solutions for a country the size of New Zealand. So we've just got to show a lot more faith and trust in each other at that level, because the rest of the world trusts us. And I think we need to pick up on what the rest of the world thinks about Kiwis.
Oh, I love that. Faith and trust. That's the takeout from this. Now, there's quite a few questions on the message board. So the first one from Santosh: is there a way for foreign entrepreneurs to move their company and family to New Zealand in a time frame that's reasonable for startups? But his question is, do you have any advice for tech entrepreneurs wanting to move to New Zealand?
Do it when you're 24. I don't know. All I can say is that there's a great talent pool here. For all that, like any country, but like knocking our education system, our kids are coming through with a very broad contextual view of learning. And they're so much more capable and getting such a better education, I feel, than I got when I was a teenager going to comprehensive schools in the UK. So, it's a good place to tap into great talent. And we often hear about, the need for tech migrant visas and so on, which is certainly as an immigrant not arguing against at all. But we have so much capability here to build and nurture on. So, yeah, sorry, I can't answer that question more directly. We've obviously set up businesses overseas, and you just go through the normal process.
And it's easy to set up a business here, as we know. It's really easy to do that.
It is. That's true. Yeah. The barriers are low.
So you've opened the door on education and talent. I think we'll go back to Mark's question from the message board to wrap this, because it's a good last question. So let's just talk about education and talent. You would have seen I've been making a bit of a fuss recently about the uptake of students learning STEM subjects, having the diminishing numbers of students in STEM subjects, and also the trend downwards of students moving into digital technology courses in higher education. And there was this massive decline in what TEC have been funding in the digital technology higher education space. There also seems to be a decline in businesses. And I know Catalyst is an amazing employer because you take on interns and graduates all the time, but there's been a decline in businesses who are prepared to take on interns and graduates. So I guess my question to you, you've been able to do it for 20-something years. What needs to change? How do we encourage more employers to take on interns and graduates and take that risk on people at the beginning of their career? And I don't know if you can hear banging happening above me, which is quite frustrating timing. And how do we encourage more kids to get into STEM and get into tech? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll answer the first question first, the second question first, sorry, that's right. I think, so, I started my career sort of at the age of 18-ish. I picked up a book on learning basic written by somebody called William Gates, which is, you'll understand the irony. But I wasn't good at maths. I wasn't, I did some science, but I preferred history and French and English. And I think we make a mistake telling our kids that you've got to be good at science and maths to get into programming anyway. Programming is about seeing patterns. It's different. If somebody wants a mathematical formula, you look it up or somebody gives it to you, but programming is different. And programming has its origins in weaving. The first computers were the punch cards that used to drive steam looms. And I was fortunate enough to be in Fiji the other week and staying in a bure with a beautiful woven ceiling and really intricate infrastructure to keep it up. And just looking at the patterns and again, thinking about weaving and crafts and so on, and just how much of that is about finding patterns and creating new things out of those patterns and then repeating those patterns. And that's what programming is. And we don't explain that enough to children going through the education system. So I'd like us to just to challenge a little bit the thinking around what we tell people. The other people that write code are lawyers, right? We don't tell people that lawyers have to be mathematicians, but if you look at a legal contract, it's got a definition system, it's a definition sector, it's got variables, it's got paragraphs that self-reference, all the way through. And you never try and repeat a sentence if you can refer to section 2, 3b, part 5, right? So it's just the same as code, but we don't tell lawyers that they have to be mathematicians. So that's something I'm thinking about in terms of how to get more people into IT at a technical level in a way that makes it more accessible to people. And I think that's something that's important for us to do. Then the first question was about how to get companies to take on more interns. And, I do acknowledge that that's hard, particularly if in, New Zealand companies tend to be cash flow constrained. But I also know that the people coming out of our education system, whether it's schools, polytechnics or university or Wanaga, are really capable and they're really smart. They're certainly more capable and smart than well, that was probably not that hard, but than my generation, I'll say. And if we don't show faith in that capability, then they're going to leave, and we're going to wonder why there's another, 20,000 people gone to Australia or to Silicon Valley or wherever, and we're going to blame whoever's in government. The reality is we need to show faith in our younger people ourselves, and it is hard. And I know certainly for us at Catalyst, it's been harder in the last couple of years to take on as many interns as we'd like to. Another thing that's cheaper if you can't afford an intern is to give a student a grant, give them $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000 a year, just as they're going through their tertiary education. They'll appreciate that and they'll remember that.
Nice. Yeah. I've been talking, David Downs and I've been talking about what we can do to stimulate more support or scholarships. So that's a really good point. I loved your weaving analogy. Yeah, I loved your weaving analogy. And I think I said to you the other day, obviously, Professor Tim Bell shares that view because CS Unplugged has a lot of really tactile activities to teach kids about cognitive thinking and problem solving without being anywhere near a computer, and a lot of them are craft type activities. So maybe we should get all our heads together. Right, we've got 5 minutes of this scheduled time left, and Mark has asked a question that's going to take you more than 5 minutes to answer. Thank you, Mark. Mark has said, Don, the new government seems enthusiastic about tech, but do you see it driving yet the tech-related policies or initiatives that New Zealand needs? If not, what are your top three?
Mark's probably closer to the answer to this question than I am.
Well, you've already talked about open standards.
No, I think it's adjunct. I think the tech policy is adjunct to some of the other policy stuff that I was talking about at the moment. And whether that's social investment, whether it's Minister for Education talking about focusing on Māori and Pacifica students that are dropping out of high school, and students from disadvantaged economic backgrounds getting a much better outcome from education. I think those are all kind of like initiatives, and there's the MSD investment, hopefully in the first however many thousand days of a baby's life. Those are all initiatives that will need to be supported by IT that can't be done with a big digital transformation project. I think, surely digital transformation happened in the 1980s. And if it didn't happen when everyone had a PC in the desk, surely it happened when we got the internet. And then surely it happened when we all got one of these. So anyone that's talking about digital transformation is just lazy. It really is about being adjunct to delivering to those sort of policies, and same in the commercial and private sector. I think, sort of getting that through. What was it? The top three, something other. Mark's just deleted his question.
Oh, sorry, that was my fault. Yeah, what are your top three priorities for this government?
Well, anything that has a combination of these four words: digital transformation, cloud first, should be a non-starter. You just know it's going to fail, right? Because none of those are based on valuable outcomes that are measurable and so on. I have a cloud company. We have Catalyst Cloud, and it has 3 data centers and it delivers cloud. But anyone that has a cloud-only policy without thinking about the costs, I can almost guarantee that 30 to 40% of an organization's digital costs now are going straight out to Amazon or Microsoft.
It's just someone else's computing that you're paying for, right? Yeah.
So why are we renting when we should own? Let's bring that sort of housing type ambition into the IT space and say, as a country, why are we becoming renters rather than owners? And I know there's a time to lease and rent and so on. I don't own my office building, but I know it's here in New Zealand.
Nice.
And really, so focusing our IT ambitions on what's the thing we're trying to deliver now, and how can we use the best solution for now rather than some homogenous, all-encompassing thing that will just ensure that by the time we get the solution, it's 5 years out of date.
That's a good priority. I think it's great. And also kill that cloud first thing that's been around for 10 years. The whole time we've been doing NZRise, we've been hearing that same rhetoric from DIA. So move on.
Yeah, and I got into a little bit of trouble. I got into a little bit of trouble last year because I pointed out that I'd never seen any economic case for, regardless of whether it's government or private sector, for a cloud first policy. And that's what I want to see. I want to see somebody say, yes, for this solution at this point, it makes sense to have everything on the cloud. But you know what, when we get to a certain scale, let's call it a bank or a large government agency, we should be thinking about alternatives to this. We should be thinking about private cloud. We should be thinking about other things, because cloud's expensive and it's a drain. It's not really adding to our long-term future. So that's why I'm saying let's own it, not rent it.
Right. I think that's a good place to wrap this, and it's 1:15, so we're meant to finish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, Don. Thanks everyone for your questions. Someone called Jennifer.
I think I only lost 10 people. That's good.
Oh, it's not about how many people are watching. Jennifer just agreed with your point that remember that the first word is important. Once you've tested a design, go right ahead and own the solution, which is exactly what you've just been saying. So thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah.
I will let you all
Sure.
get back to your day. Ka kite.